Hello, I'm Paul Laney.
And I'm Lauren Matthews.
And you're listening to JailTalk. And she's back.
War Eagle.
Yes, War Eagle it is. We are coming to you here from the TKC studios in River Falls, Wisconsin. And we have Dr. Miller back with us. It's been a few months. It's great to see you again.
It's great to be here.
Challenge accepted.
Auburn is on my chest. Auburn is in here. Auburn's on my purse, and Auburn's on my phone. War Eagle.
I had told her the last time we were here, I was just shocked she wasn't decked out in all her colors, because anybody that recognizes Dr. Miller, you also know Auburn University goes wherever she goes. And as we, got to fly your colors, I guess, right?
Always.
Well, we are very, very privileged to have you back. You're a regular friend of our show. You're a regular friend of Turnkey Corrections. And our first couple shows with you were just amazing. And we're just excited to have you back. As we've said, and not to sound like a broken record, but we had promised our listeners we were going to walk the walk we talk and deliver high-quality information for them. If they're going to take time out of their day, out of their busy days, whether they're working in the jail, whether they're out in the field, and sit down and listen to a podcast or do a studio cast like we do here as well, I want it to be worth every minute of their time. And you know what? You deliver every minute and really make it worth their time. So we're really, really excited to have you here today. So what are we going to talk about today, Doc?
Well, we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, though honestly uncomfortable topic. We're going to talk about conflict. And that is difficult, and it is challenging, it is uncomfortable, but we are going to dive in and talk about how we can turn conflict into conversation.
All right.
Great.
Well, I tell you what, we know all about your background. And we know that you deliver all those messages you talk about. But I think for our initial people, if you haven't seen the first episode, please go back. We did a part 1 and a part 2. I feel, not because of Lauren and I, but because of this lady sitting right here, the content was amazing. And we just had the privilege to be able to kind of guide that conversation. But we know your background. If you're tuning in as a first time, Lauren, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about our guest?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have Dr. Kimberly Miller. She is a licensed police and public safety psychologist and sought-after speaker and consultant who has been inspiring and motivating individuals in our profession for over 16 years. She owns her own consulting firm and has worked with over 150 public safety organizations and provided training for tens of thousands of students around the country through her local, regional, national, and online training programs. Her programs and services are designed to improve not only the individual line-level employee skills, but also the organization as a whole. Dr. Miller's educational background includes a bachelor's degree in psychology from Auburn University,
War Eagle,
a master's degree in clinical psychology from Ball State University, and a PhD in consulting psychology from Colorado State University. And she is the current president of NSA Psychological Services Board. Whew. I get out of breath every time I do that.
So you just kind of sit around and don't do a whole lot every day. Wow.
Nothing.
Very impressive. And again, we are very honored that you're here to share some of this with us. First episode, we talked about bounceability and resilience. And, we've shared what we're going to talk about today. And as we talk about conflict and all that. So let's just get this show on the road and get the War Eagle flying. How's that?
Yes, sounds great. So I want to start with y'all, and I want you to think for a minute about when you hear the word conflict. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think. What are the initial thoughts and feelings that come to mind when you hear me say the word conflict?
Well, for me, I right away, when you say that, I think anger and confrontation.
Okay, so negative. What about you?
I would say kind of fighting and avoidance.
Perfect. So again, negative. I think we can all relate to that. When I think about conflict myself, I think about a fight and I think about winning and losing. Mm-hmm. So I think of a situation where people don't really resolve it.
Right.
And get to the other side. So when you think about these negative feelings and thoughts in terms of conflict, what usually happens in conflict when people show up in these negative ways, and what do y'all feel like the ultimate outcome often is with people when they're in conflict?
I feel like a lot of times people come to conflict with kind of preconceived notions. They know their opinion, especially when they know they're going into a conflict or an argument. And so the result is just it never gets solved. Because if you're only going into that conflict with your own preconceived notions, you're not listening to what the other person is saying. So it just never gets solved.
Perfect. What about you, Paul?
And I guess when I think of that, the anger and the confrontation, I think about like maybe reacting before you speak. And sometimes you're going to say something without thinking, you probably regret. And as soon as it comes out of your mouth, you think, oh, maybe I should have said that different, or that didn't come out the right way. I saw the look on his or her face, and that I just compounded the problem. So that's kind of what I think.
So would y'all say it's fair to say that most people in the world probably have a negative perception of conflict, probably aren't excited about going into conflict, and more often than not probably don't have the conflict that ends up in a resolution, a productive resolution?
No, I would agree with that. I think most people avoid conflict. I mean, unless you have this, it's one thing to have, when you want to get out on a football field and smash heads because you're playing a game. Right. That's a different kind of, a conflict. When I think of conflict, I think of, whether it's in the hallways or you hear the media talking about there's a conflict going on in some country. They're fighting. They're at war. So whoever, I don't look forward to that. I mean, I think conflict is something we have to do, especially if you're in leadership positions or you got to deal with it. But I don't think anybody looks forward to it.
What do you think?
I agree. I think that's why avoidance came to my mind, is because people, they want to avoid it. I would say 90% of people want to avoid it. And I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. So yeah, I think Paul hit the nail on the head with that.
Yep.
Well, I think a lot of times, like you said, they attack if they feel cornered, or they feel, like they're if there's a conflict being directed towards them, or they attack. They attack back.
So let's think about that. If most people have a negative view of conflict, and most people have had negative experiences with conflict, and we go in with our own agenda, trying to be right, trying to attack people, and then we end up not really getting to resolution. So what I said is, you have a winner and a loser, then that just ends up reinforcing that conflict's bad, right? So I want y'all to think about it, because in the first episode, we talked a lot about mindset. And if we go into conflict in a negative space, if we go into conflict thinking about winning and losing and fighting and attacking and maybe beating somebody up and proving that we're right and they're wrong, what ends up happening is we just create more badness, more lack of resolution, more you're either on the winning or the losing side. And then it just reinforces that negative narrative. Conflict's bad. Conflict's painful. If you're not the one beaten up, you're the one getting beat up. And it just creates this perpetuating negative narrative that leads people to avoid.
So how do you tie that together then? How do you tie that together with that mindset, and how do you bring that around?
So here's the first step, and the most uncomfortable step. And no one's going to like this advice. But it's what you need to do. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So think about that. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Now, that's the hardest thing to do, because if your history has been conflict's bad, conflict's negative, I get beat up, it doesn't feel good, why would you ever start looking at it differently? But if you remember from the first episode, if you have a negative story, you create a negative outcome. If you start with a positive story, if you start saying, you know what, I can't necessarily control the outcome. I can't necessarily control what you do, but I do have control of what I do. And if I focus on that and say, you know what, I can't even control what Lauren does, but I'm going to show up with a positive mindset, and I'm going to show up with the agenda of us actually figuring out the problem and getting to a solution. Then I'm in control of me, which is the only thing we ever control, and therefore I also help to control the outcome of that. Now, that's super hard. I know some of you are like, come on, mindset. Well, I can't look at that this way. And inmates are always difficult. And my coworker is always difficult. And man, you know how the sheriff is. You know how those sheriffs can be.
I do.
But if you don't change your story, even if for today, the only story you can start with is, you know what? I am here to listen to this podcast and find one thing I can do different. Mm-hmm. And if I listen to this podcast and there's only one thing that I can do different, then I'm going to be better. Then you started. Then you have a new story.
What, you mean we have to change our ways?
Yeah. Well, only if you want a new outcome.
Yes.
Now,
I'm being facetious.
Right. So if you listen to this podcast and you're like, actually, I don't want to change. Well, then turn it off now because we have nothing for you. Now, if you're listening to this podcast and you want to be different, we are going to give you a step-by-step plan on how to be different and explore the tools to be different. But let's all first just take a breath. Remember those deep breaths, not with our shoulders, with our tummies pooched out. Ready? So let's take a deep breath. Exhale. All right, let's start. Now that we're in a calm, neurophysically good space. So the first tool, in addition to having a better story, right? Because let's just say the story is, I'm going to find one tool. Second thing, get out of the space of blaming. Because sort of what y'all said is when you go into the conflict, you're like, who's right, who's wrong? I'm going to prove my point. I'm going to prove I'm better. We have to get out of blame because blame focuses on a single contributor. And y'all know conflict takes at least two people. So if we focus on blame, we're on the single journey instead of looking at contribution. Because when we get in conflict, we all say, well, Lauren started it. You know how she is, Paul. Lauren started it.
She usually does.
She did it first.
Right.
And if she wouldn't have done the thing she did, I wouldn't have to yell at her.
Right.
So if you see how people say that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm excusing my yelling by saying she started it first, by let's say rolling her eyes, then I am immediately absolved of any responsibility. It's better to talk about contribution. Right? We could say, well, Lauren started because she rolled her eyes, but you know what? I added to it. I added gas on the fire because then I yelled, which then made her defensive. So what I should do is own my part. Because if I say, you know what, Lauren, you're right. I shouldn't have yelled at you. Then she'll probably say, you know what? And I shouldn't have rolled my eyes. And now we're already down the road of a conversation instead of conflict because we're not trying to prove who's right and who's wrong. How does that feel to y'all? Does that feel too much to do early on, or does that feel like something you think people could hold on to and make a positive step on?
I think one of the biggest things we need to do as human beings is self-assess ourselves. Because none of us are perfect. We always walk around and say, nobody's perfect. You can't be perfect. Well, if you're not being perfect and you can't be perfect, then there's probably a way you're causing to the issues. And I think a strong person, if you're going to be strong in character and strong in mind, then you have to ask yourself, am I part of the problem here? Mm-hmm. And if you can ask yourself that honestly, and then honestly tell yourself, you know what, I have to admit, put aside your pride and ego. I used to always say, put your ego and your pride in your back pocket where it belongs, mm-hmm. and have a meaningful conversation. And mm-hmm. I think, when I think of that, how I look at it and hearing what you're saying, that's me and Lauren saying, okay, I got angry when you rolled your eyes and I apologize for what I said. And you're right. And then maybe she says, I'm sorry I rolled my eyes. I didn't mean to upset you. Now we have dialogue.
Right.
And then we can probably move past it.
And then if you can start with that, get out of blame and just talk about how did you show up in a way that contributed? How did I show a way up contributed? Then we can get to the second step. And here's what a lot of people fight over. What's the truth? And I don't like to talk about politics because everybody on every side thinks they're right. And in our world today, everybody's like, this side is right and this side is wrong. But if we looked at truth a little bit differently, and we said, well, because I think we all agree truth is relative, right? There's some absolute facts like gravity, like that's truth. But outside of that and a few other things, truth is relative. It's all about perspective. So I think if we could dissect truth also in the beginning of the conversation and stop seeing it as what's true, start seeing it as what's important, right? Because I might say, well, Lauren, you rolled your eyes and that's disrespectful. And Lauren's like, I wasn't disrespectful. I was rolling my eyes because I was frustrated because we've had this conversation 20 times. But if I keep hammering home, no, it was disrespectful. and I'm telling her what her eye roll meant, we're going to get in a fight about her eye roll and not what about the conversation. Do you see what I mean?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we all fight about, this side's right and this side is wrong, or you said this and that's what this means to me. Why don't we just say, so Lauren, what was the eye roll about? Help me understand. You seem like you were having a negative reaction. And then she could go, well, I'm frustrated because I feel like this is the 100th time we've had this conversation and we don't make progress. Well, if we got to that space, we can now get down in the reason that I feel like I have to keep bringing it up and ask her why she feels like we're not making progress. But I don't know about y'all's experience about that, but I feel like people get in these battles about what's true and they don't get down to that next level. What do you think about that? How have you seen that play out in work or personal and just see people burn negative emotion about beating up what's true?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it all the time. I think if you think of even just like being in a meeting, if you don't have like that end goal, you're just going in a circle, especially if it's a, like a hot topic or something like that. Like if you don't really have that end goal, then you're just going to be spinning in circles because you don't really know what you're going towards. And then the truth really never comes out then, because who knows what the truth is, because what are we even trying to get to?
Right.
I think a lot of times people, for lack of better terms, listen to respond. They don't listen to hear what you're saying. I'm listening so I can tell you why I'm right. And I'm not listening to understand what you are saying. And I think a lot of times we've made up our mind what we think it is or how it's going to be. So when I'm listening to you, it's like I'm listening already to how I can now respond to make you see my point, not listen to hear what you're trying to tell me. And I think if we take that breath and say, okay, what is Dr. Miller trying to tell me? What is Kimberly trying to say? And then respond back, having heard what you said rather than listening so that I can tell you what you need, what I understood.
Right. And a part of that, you make a great point about how we don't really ever listen. Well, the only thing we listen to is, are you speaking my same language? And do you see my same truth? And are you agreeing with me? Because then if you are, it's like, oh yeah, we're right. And you know how he is. And we don't get to that other level. We don't try to figure out, what am I saying? And then can you repeat that back? Can you paraphrase that back so that I know that you got it?
Right.
Even if you end up saying after that, and I have a slightly different perspective. Let me share my different perspective with you. And instead of me getting immediately defensive and going, oh my gosh, I told him not going to listen to this because, he's wrong and that's just his opinion. It's not really the truth. Then I put up that next wall and I'm not listening to you because you're not speaking the same language. You're not speaking my truth.
I think the organizations that truly have, when you think about organizational communication and what goes on, organizational communication and the fact that you have whether it's a law enforcement agency, whether it's a private company, whether it's an educational setting, whatever the case may be, that you're not having a great place to work because you always agree is not necessarily what it's about. Having a great place to work is because you can communicate your differences in the right way, and you listen to hear, not listen to respond, and you respect your coworkers. And you see signs all around different companies, stuff like that. Well, you don't just look at them as a decoration on the wall. What do they mean? What is when it says respect? When it says communicate, what is it? What does that mean? And so I think a lot of times, as we all look into ourselves and how we respond, we all have our work environment, we all have our home environment, and how do we listen and how do we communicate? And I think that's the difference. The successful places doesn't mean they all get along.
Right.
The successful places means they know how to communicate effectively.
Yeah. And when I reflect on that, and I'm interested to hear y'all's tools that you use, but when I think about how do I get out of my own way and listen to really hear the other person instead of listening to make sure that I'm right and they're agreeing with me, or plan with the worst we all have done. As somebody's talking, we plan and plot our attack. So I go, and I do all the nonverbals, and you think that I'm listening, and actually I'm writing a list. I mean, that's stupid, and that's wrong, and wait till you shut up, because then I'm going to tell you what's wrong with you. And I've had to get out of my way in terms of that, like my whole life. I'm way better now, let me say, because I practice. But what I do is I really try to have a framework of curiosity. I try to ask myself, especially if they're saying things I don't like or saying things I don't agree with, I try to say, I wonder where this is coming from. Oh, is there a follow-up question that I could ask? Because that's really interesting. Or they just gave me feedback about that I was disrespectful. Well, gosh, I got to follow up and see, tell me more about that. Can you tell me what I specifically did? So instead of getting that immediate, like, oh, I'm going to push back and defend, I start saying to myself, okay, be curious. Why might they think that? And let me ask another question so that I stay engaged and I understand where they're coming from. So what do y'all use? What are your tools so that you're listening to understand instead of being understood?
I think for me, like I said before, if I know I'm going into a conflict, giving myself that space to try to understand their perspective before I'm even at that point, because once you get into a conflict, I think a lot of times it's really heated and you maybe are speaking in spur of the moment, you're not meaning what you're saying. So calming myself down before I even go into a conflict and then going into it with that open mind, I think right away it allows you to see their perspective, and then you are just listening to how they're feeling and what they're actually saying rather than your preconceived notions of what you think they should be saying or what you want to hear from them.
That's perfect. And we'll talk in a few minutes about being at that 0 space instead of at 99 starting a conflict. So that's wonderful. What about you, Paul?
You know, I think I have a different perspective in the sense because having had a 30-year career in a mid-sized law enforcement agency, I was the one that had to learn that as a young guy and as a young patrolman coming up, and then moving into command positions, supervisory, and then command positions, and then running for office, and then at some point, I'm running an organization of 200 plus staff, so I had to be then the one to make sure we were communicating the right way, that we were utilizing these tools. So I've had the benefit of that, so I can look back on how I communicated when I was younger, and it was a lot more of like what you said, my way or the highway. I was a Marine. I was used to just saying it like it is and getting it done, and I had to teach myself as I went through and absorb things from trainings, and went to trainings like from people like you, and learn to communicate a different way. And then I had I believe communication is one of the biggest things you do. When I teach my leadership classes, I do big chunks on communication and how to effectively communicate. So I think for me, and you always gotta, I'll relay a little bit, maybe a little bit later, a different part of that, but I learned to try to listen better. I learned that, when they came into my office, sometimes it was, like when I was a supervisor on the street, a sergeant or a lieutenant, I sometimes just had my people come in and they weren't looking for me so much to solve a problem as they just needed somebody to vent to. And I had to determine, is this a solution moment where you're looking at me to solve something for you, or you just need an ear? And you just need to listen. And that's where I think I started first learning that sometimes I need to process this. I don't need to just listen to hear to tell you something else. I need to listen. And there was one time I remember I had an officer come in and vented to me for about 20 minutes. And I looked at him. I said, "You feel better now?" He's like, "Yeah." I said, "All right, hit the street." And it was done. And that's just what he needed, was an ear, and knew that I cared and that his opinion mattered to me. And whether I went out and made an effective change 2 minutes later really wasn't on his agenda, but the fact that I listened to him and I listened effectively to him. And so, I mean, nobody's perfect. I certainly have had my failures over the years where I thought, I should have handled that different, or I should have said something different. And I still have idiosyncrasies now that I've got to work on, and I'm sure you'll get to that at some point today. You tend to bring it. Why are we her examples? vegetables every day.
I don't know.
It's like therapy.
No doubt. Hey, we're getting it for free anyway.
true.
Right.
Exactly. So, it's I think that's the difference, where Lauren is early in her career and learning, and as, she develops and grows and, is maybe someday running the division when her boss retires, we're going to learn to communicate that way. And she's going to learn to communicate better. I've been through all that. So now I'm supposed to be the one that hopefully knows what I'm doing and can share it back to the younger generations and to my teams. And something that I think, as I talked about in the very first episode, that when we put those stripes on, those bars on, those stars on, we have a responsibility to do that. And that was something I embraced but you never quit learning. And already after, these first few visits with you, it's refreshed things with me because I run a team here. I run a national sales team now. And, we don't wear gun belts. We go out and sell technology, but it's, the communication things, the things that you do as a leader don't change.
Right.
And so, already, I've made notes on, I can do that better.
So, it just makes me think about just the other day in my personal life, one of my family members and I were having a discussion, let's say, and it was productive discussion. And later on in the conversation, as we were both expressing our feelings and our thoughts about this particular issue, the person came back and said, I'm really sorry about what I said earlier in the conversation because I now see that wasn't really fair and that wasn't really right. And they said, but I really appreciate you didn't just jump on me and attack me because sometimes I just have to get it out. Sometimes I just have to say it in a not pretty way, in a not well thought out way. I mean, it triggered me when you said your deputy coming in and venting. That I think part of listening for me has been the intentional practice of giving people grace, of saying, you know what, they're probably not always going to say it the pretty way. They're not always going to say it the best way. And let's be honest, I don't always say it the best way. But if I cannot get super angry and defensive, if I cannot immediately attack back, if we can just stay in that dialogue and that space of conversation instead of just immediately poking each other or reacting, the person was later able to self-correct. I didn't have to say anything. No. I didn't have to say that wasn't fair, that wasn't right, or that hurt my feelings. They self-reflected as the conversation continued. I said, you know what? Thank you for just giving me the space to not say it pretty because I just had to get it out. And now that we're in a conversation, we can figure it out. And I said, well, you're welcome. I said, look, I don't always say things the best, but I've really intentionally practiced. Don't just attack back. Give grace, and let's just stay in a conversation. Like you said, let's stay calm. Let's stay down here towards zero instead of escalating ourselves up in a place that's going to bring back, right, the self-fulfilling negative prophecy that we're going to end up in a fight and it's going to be a winner and a loser.
And maybe this is a little off topic, but we have a lot of commanders and a lot of supervisors watching this, and I think maybe for just a second touch on the topic that when one of your people comes in and needs to talk to you like that, or you're having that conflict, don't feel like you always have to have the answer for them or the perfect answer. That's one thing I learned too. We've all had those supervisors who make something up so they felt like they knew what they were talking about, and you're like sitting there going, "Really? You think I'm that dumb?" You just made that up so you look like you know what you're talking about. You don't have to do that. If you don't know the perfect answers, I don't know, but I'll find out. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like a simple thing, but so many fall into that trap of I'm a supervisor, I have to know everything. No, you don't. You need to communicate, and you need to show you care, and then you need to be able to say, I'm going to get you an answer on that, and then come back with valid information. Mm-hmm. They'll respect you so much more. So I know it's a little off what we said, but I think it happens so often in communication environments.
Well, and the other thing that I think is a really good grounding tool, like I use your kind of idea of de-escalation and starting at zero as a good grounding tool, a place to start. Another one that I think of as you say that is, have we ever just asked somebody what they need? Think about that. Do we ever in a conflict just say, what do you need? Most of us don't. But here, let me give you a big secret. Underneath every conflict, right? And think of the emotional tornado is up here. The fighting, the anger, the hurt, the attacking, the, triggers, pushing buttons and all that. if we can get out of that tornado, as Lauren said, get down to sort of zero when we can have a conversation. What underlies every single conflict in the world, period, is an unmet need. There's something that you need or want right now that you cannot have. Right? And so maybe that is respect. Maybe that's being understood. Maybe that is you just need a space, like you said, to vent. You just need an outlet because the situation is not going to change. The person is not going to change. The circumstance with the inmate is not going to change. You just need to get the emotion out so you can go back to work and not get yourself in a conflict. But how many times when we're interacting with somebody we supervise or our family member or our children or our best friend, how often do we start the conversation by saying, what do you need right now? We don't. Because we're like, shh, bring it on. I'm right and you're wrong. Here we go.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, Lauren, you seem like you're upset. Tell me what you need right now. What's going on? Tell me about we don't do any of that.
And I think that leader or that person, I mean, they always say leaders. I always look at things from that perspective, but I think so much too now how it has to be the tone, because that was sincere when you asked her, what do you need right now? Because if there's that way, or there can be, what do you need now?
Yes. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you said
the same
that.
words, because as you were saying that, I'm like, that was sincere and all that, but it's such a pitfall, because if you're tired, you're crabby, you've been out on the streets, you had a big incident, and then she comes in and something super important to her, and it's like, what do you want now? Mm-hmm. The whole conversation's done. Already she's like, oh. Do I even want to talk?
Nothing.
Nope, just want to say hi. Yeah. And it might have been a very big thing for her that, so I think we all have, especially in leadership positions, have to be very self-aware how we communicate those words.
So I'm going to put you on the spot. Where does that approach come from? Where does what do you want? What do you want? Why are you here? Where does that emanate from?
I think, frustration, you're tired, you're a human being. So I think that goes back to the episode 1 when you talk about strong in body, strong in mind, keeping yourself right, because when you put yourself in those positions, you have said, I'm going to respond the right way. And so if you let yourself get frustrated, you let yourself get overtired, you let yourself have, very negative things in your life, that's how you're going to respond, and that's how people are going to see you. So I think it's so important that we keep ourselves strong in body, strong in mind is what I always say, but because that's where that comes from, because I can still be tired. I could have just come off a critical incident, or I could have just come off a long couple shifts because, we're short people or whatever the case may be, and still be that tired. And she walks in, she's coming to see me for a reason. And if she's coming in and saying, hey, Sarge, hey, LT, I got to talk to you, and it's like, and you're still that tired, but you found that character and the strength, you're like, what's on your mind? All right, let's chat. Sit down. Let's talk. Or instead of that, because it changes the whole dynamic of, fine, sit down.
The eye roll was so good.
Yeah, and it all kind of reminds me of what we talked about in the first few podcasts of the Ark.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. Build the ark. Perfect. Build the ark before it rains. You talked about that in the first podcast, and that's kind of, I think, I never thought of it that way until you just said it, but exactly that. You got to be strong, and you got to build that foundation and that arc before the crisis. And it fits.
So we're going to get back into the props. If you haven't seen the first one, you're missing out. You got to get into that. So it's the idea of, is your default this, or is your default this? Because if you are, as Paul said, burnt out and stressed out and exhausted, and you haven't slept in weeks, and you've been doing mandatory overtime, and you already have a negative mindset, and you don't know how to personally de-escalate, and you haven't had a vacation in 6 years, you don't have a good default. That when you're on your last leg, you are not going to show up well when somebody comes in who is in a bad space and needs to talk. This is going to be your default. You have nothing to offer the world. And as silly as it seems, self-care, regular sleep, taking care of your body will enable you to do conflict better. But you have to practice this all the time, because y'all know in law enforcement that if you don't practice self-care, you end up with poop all over you, which means a poopy mind, a poopy heart, a poopy attitude, a poopy voice, and bad conflict. And bad relationships, and strained relationships, not only in your office space, but in your home space. and you won't be able to practice effectively. So a couple other things I want to talk about as we're on this prepare ahead of time, practice ahead of time. One is understand that when you get in a conflict, there's going to be likely a gap in perspective. The way you see things, the way you talk about things, your view of a meeting, your view of a way inmates behaving or somebody on the roads behaving, there's likely to be a gap in perspective. And remember, you can fill the gap with curiosity or judgment. That's the two options. Most people fill it with judgment because they're trying to be right and they're trying to prove that they know better, etc., instead of filling the space with curiosity and saying, so how is it that you see it like that? Well, I had a totally different experience with that inmate. I had a totally different experience of that citizen who came up and was yelling at you. I wanted to jump on him. And you might say, man, they were just upset. They weren't attacking me. They were mad at the circumstance.
Right.
So I didn't take it personal. And I'm sitting there going, how did you not take that personal? And sometimes when we do that, I don't mean to, but I try to push your button and escalate you to get in my perspective by saying, you should be offended, Paul. You should be upset, Paul. How are you not upset by that? Have you experienced that in your career where other people, well-meaning people in the sheriffing world, try to escalate you up when...
Oh. Yeah, often.
So what do you usually do about that? I know you said you've grown over time, you've learned over time. How do you, in that moment of maybe one or more people trying to push a button, how do you not react to that?
Well, there was the Paul that was the 24-year-old patrol officer, and then there was the Paul that was the 45-year-old sheriff. Very different people in the sense, same guy but different perspectives. Early on, I probably reacted more. I probably was more assertive or more aggressive in my argument or in my point. But as I got older and wiser and grew, I saw things from a very, very different perspective. And so I used to always, when I used to teach, like officer response to domestic violence or things like that, I always talked about out in the field, if we as officers lose control, who has it then? Nobody has it. Well, I kind of felt that way also in the leadership environment of our people. If I don't have control of my emotions or I don't have control of what's going on, then who does? And especially if you're the senior leaders. So I always looked at it from that perspective. I tried to always remind myself, you have to be the logical one. You have to be the one in control. You have to be the one to pull out the best in them and not push for the worst in them. And so I just always tried to push myself to be better and to be a better leader and to educate myself and try to be, the stronger in body, strong in mind, like you said. I'd always got those messages earlier. That's always a battle I think everybody has because you're tired and you have kids and you probably need that another 2 hours of sleep, but you got court at 1 o'clock and then you got your kids' basketball game at 6 o'clock and then you got to go back on shift at 11 and you're trying to balance all of that. And that's the daily world for these law enforcement officers out there is that's every day. That's just not, well, if that only happens once every 6 months, it's probably not a big deal. But that's pretty much their daily lives. Right. And so I tried to always remind myself, be the one to de-escalate, not escalate.
Right.
I have always truly felt this. It's easy to piss somebody off. It's easy
totally
to walk into a room, whether you're handling a call or you're talking to a coworker. The easy way out is to turn it confrontational. The true person that can take a situation up here, whether you're out in the field, whether you're in the pod, or you're talking to a coworker, the true leader, the true person with character is the one who de-escalates the situation and brings it down. So I always try to keep that in mind.
Well, and we're back to the arc again. I feel like it's the intentional practice of that mindset on a regular basis, intentionally being curious, intentionally learning how to ask people questions that brings them down instead of judging, like you said, listening, instead of judging a response, listening and saying, tell me more about why you look at it that way. Tell me more about how you ended up in this circumstance and you ended up making that decision. And it takes a person, and I would say with good energy boundaries, to not catch other people's emotions, because emotions are very, 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 very catchy. And if we're not careful, we're going to get triggered. Somebody's going to throw a negative emotion on us that's going to stick. And then we're going to start responding to their emotion instead of what you said is, no, I'm not going to catch it. I have good energy boundaries. Just because you're angry and yelling doesn't mean I'm going to get angry. I'm going to stay in a calm space. I already have good emotional control, and I'm not going to catch it. But I think a lot of people, not only who work in law enforcement, but I see it in my family, like every Christmas, y'all know it happens at usually the cutting of the turkey. Somebody gets mad because they're not cutting the turkey, and they've always cut the turkey, and then here goes the fight. Right. And it usually is involved alcohol too, so y'all know how this goes.
Well, you're not telling any cop that's worked the street anything new on that, because during the holidays, yes, that you see a lot of that, and you end up responding to a lot of that, and usually there were pretty silly arguments over something really silly. And what a shock, alcohol was involved.
Indeed. So part of being better at conflict is starting at a good space mentally and emotionally before you get into it. And then just because somebody is angry and trying to throw their stuff on you, just say, you know what, I'm not catching that today. I'm not going to do that today. And be intentional about saying in your head, I'm not catching the anger. I'm not catching the frustration.
So if I'm having a conflict with someone, if Lauren and I are having that go around, now I'm using us as the example.
Oh, See, I'm contaminating.
Yes. So you're saying, if I'm being assertive and I'm being aggressive, she should be looking at that, saying, I'm not catching his poop. I'm not going to do that. It's a conflict resolution technique, is just to say, I'm not biting.
No, yeah. And just say that.
Good advice.
Hard to do. Because the people that know you the best know the buttons to push. Mm-hmm. Now, your work is to not let them push those buttons. And that's super hard. Because if they bring up Aunt Sally and you just escalate, you need to learn how to not react to Aunt Sally, which brings us back to the arc and brings us back to you got to practice ahead of time. Now, I know y'all think this is nuts. But if you're going to be better at conflict, you actually have to practice conflict resolution skills ahead of time, outside of a conflict. And if you're going to go into a potential scary conflict, and I know nobody in public safety likes role plays, you need to do the role play. You need to do it with a friend, with your supervisor, whoever. You need to find somebody you trust and say, look, Lauren, I got to talk to Paul. Oh my gosh, you know how he is. Can you and I role play? You just act like Paul, and you know all the bad stuff he does, and he tries to throw anger on me and all this stuff. And I have her be Paul, and then I practice not responding. Now, I know y'all are rolling your eyes going, are you kidding me? No, because we all practice like we perform. Excuse me. We perform like we practice. I had that backwards. Right? If you want to perform better in a conflict, you have to practice ahead of time. So that might be a role play in a difficult conversation you have up. But day to day, how can you be at zero? Day to day, how can you practice using curiosity? Day to day, how can you say, oh, I'm not catching that anger. I'm going to sit here and take a breath. Nobody knows what I'm thinking, but they are crazy and I'm not catching it today. And you keep all of that on the inside. But you intentionally say this stuff. You intentionally listen to understand instead of listening to be respond, understood. Yeah, and respond. But so many people don't do that. And I think that's because of a lot of things we talked about. But here's one other huge barrier that I have seen. And I want to know if y'all have heard of this term before or you haven't. Have y'all ever heard of the term overusing a strength?
Maybe not in that exact, presentation that way. I think I kind of see where you're going with it.
Do you have a strength you've ever overused that's gotten you in a bad way in a conflict? Because I have.
Yes. How did I know I was going to be your example again? Absolutely. All over joking on the side, absolutely. One of the things, I talk about communication, and I talk about how I'm so adamant about that because, so many times, coming up through the ranks, nobody ever communicates to us. Nobody ever talks to us. We never hear anything. You never tell us anything. So I always wanted to be that person that communicated effectively, but I also wanted to make sure that there was never any doubt that I wasn't the one, whether it was Sergeant Laney or Sheriff Laney, never tells us what's going on. And I think over the years I've developed maybe an overkill with it, where it's, where I'll say something at one of our command meetings or at a staff meeting now with my team now, and I'll maybe reiterate something, 3 or 4 times, and, and I'll say it and then I'll repeat it again, and then we'll talk and then I'll repeat it again. And, one of my coworkers, Brianna, who, came from the National Sheriff's world, teases me all the time. She's like, yeah, I think we got it the first 2 times, and, and it's a thing that where it's a funny, but it's, and for me, it's like, okay, I've tried to get better at that then, and maybe only say it once or twice. And I think, using your ideas, what I can do is maybe ask any questions on what we talked about. Does everybody agree this is what we're doing? Do you have any questions for me? And rather than just overkill it, because I know I did that a lot as sheriff, because I used to get teased about it there from my commanders. They're like, and in my mind, it was like, yeah, and now you got it, right? I know that you understood it. You were doodling the first time I said it. Well, now I know you got it the second, third, and fourth time. But I think that's that part where as leaders, we have to self-assess. So even with the, the years I have, I've been a supervisor since 1997, and now I'm one here. You have to self-assess, and so I've tried to be better at that. It's funny you bring that up, because that's actually something real life going on where just even last meeting she was teasing me, about talking so much, and yeah, I think we got it, and so and she does it in a funny way, but it's a pretty good message. Like, okay, hey, trust us, we got this, and so yeah, to answer your question, yes.
Yes, well, it's funny you bring up perseverance, because that's how I sort of code what you're doing. And I also struggled with that. I talked about in the first episode that perseverance is really my strength and is what helped me be super successful. And it is a strength. However, like any strength, I can overuse it. So just like you, I'm going to go, so do you get it? 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 Are we done talking? Are you sure we're done talking? Are we really sure? Paul, is there anything else you're holding on the inside?
Yeah, I got it.
Right.
Which is exactly what they're about to do at some point, right. Yes.
So I have also had to learn once is enough, maybe twice.
Right.
But then when somebody says, I understand, when somebody says, yes, I've told you everything, I don't need to go, are you sure, Lauren? Because it looks like you're still holding something on the inside. And then 10 minutes later, I walk by your desk. Lauren, are you really sure that you're holding something? It looks like you still kind of rolling your eyes as I walk by. Well, she's probably rolling her eyes because I keep coming by her desk and asking what's wrong with her. So I've had to learn how to moderate the perseverance too. My other one that I'm sure that most people who are watching this podcast can relate to is it is a gift and a strength to be honest. However, you can also use it as a weapon. And back in my younger years, it was a weapon. It's like, oh, you want me to tell you what is wrong with you? Buckle in, hold on, because here it comes. Now, I used to think that was effective, especially for people, and y'all can relate, who did me wrong. I'm like, oh, now you're open? Because I'm going to do you double wrong. Because that's right how you win a fight, right?
And all you did was compound the problem.
Absolutely. They were not open when I used honesty as a weapon. But let me be clear. The moderation of honesty doesn't mean lying or withholding the truth. That's not what it means. The moderation of honesty means you use social and emotional intelligence. You figure out when and where and how to give feedback. You give feedback in a way that is curious and not judgmental. You listen to their reaction to feedback and check in with them as you're giving the feedback. Because what I also used to do is, and it's not that I didn't have social or emotional intelligence, but when I was delivering the hard messages and people start going like this, I just keep delivering a message. And let me tell you, the wall was up and they were not listening to me. Right. And so my goal now is not to just beat people up or beat them in the face with the truth and be expedient and move on. It's really much more about delivering a message in a way that can be heard, can be understood, can be received, so that we can move in a productive fashion forward. And that also means that if I am offering my honesty, my truth, my perspective, is that I also then have to be willing to hear honesty from other people, to hear the truth about me and how I might come across in a way that I don't intend. And so I will tell you that moderation of the way that I deliver, the honesty, using my social and intelligence more, and also using my humility, because before you couldn't tell me nothing. I was right and you were wrong, and that's how it was, and I'm perfect, and oh man, it was bad in my youth. Now I'm like, you know what? Tell me how I'm flawed. Tell me how I could have delivered a better message, because my goal is, how do we create a better experience around conflict? How do we not stay in a conflict? How do we de-escalate it? And how do we actually end up in a space of conversation? And as Lauren brought up, how can we stay more at zero? Like, I don't want you from 0 to 100 to be up in that tornado of those emotions and the attack and defensiveness. Like, how can we find a way to just talk about what's going on and talk about what's underneath that conflict? Talk about the need, talk about the gap, talk about what's in the middle of the perspectives, and really be much, I guess my thing is just be much more intentional. Mm-hmm. So what's sort of your, I've said a lot, Lauren, I know. What's sort of your reflection on this, or your thoughts about these messages and how it might really help our listeners?
Well, it sounds like you're trying to tell them to find common ground. I think people come to conflict with their own opinions and not what is your opinion, or how do our opinions, like where do our opinions meet? Do we have anything in common? Are we even going to come to a positive conclusion, or are we just going to spin in circles? So I think, like, what tools do you have for that, for finding that common ground?
That's brilliant. But that's why you do this with Paul. Y'all are brilliant.
I picked a good co-host.
You did.
You did. Got it together.
So that's brilliant, because that's really what's in the middle of the gap. Mm-hmm. You're coming with one view. I'm coming with this other view. We're in a conflict. We're having a disagreement, and maybe we're starting to escalate a little bit. What is in this? Sometimes it's a cavern, right? A huge gap. Sometimes it might be, for some of you, the Grand Canyon of the gap. Right? But is there anything that you can agree on? So here's some things I like to bring up and offer as a possibility when I'm in a conflict with people. So can we at least agree that we'd like to be in a better space at the end of this conversation?
Of course.
Right. Could we at least agree that we would like to fight less? Right? Now that I know you're like, what? Fight less? But if the person on this other side of the gap is your worst enemy, you're not going to be best friends at the end of the conversation. Do you want to fight less? Now, this also might be true with Aunt Sally or Uncle Joe. Do you want to fight less? Maybe, and drink less at Christmas. It might help, right? Like, what's the thing you want to do? Do you want to have a better team dynamic, right? Even as vice presidents, you might have a conflict with another vice president on something. Is the unifying, if you have very different perspectives, is the unifying thing is we want to together create a better team environment. Okay, now you might have very different ideas about how to get there, but if you can get down to what do we agree on, what is the common ground, then that gives you a way to de-escalate out of the emotional tornado. It gives you a base that you can operate from. And instead of fighting over the different perspectives, say, okay, well, if we're going to talk about a different team environment, can we write down what we want that team environment to look like? And just write down the qualities of the team instead of fighting about the path.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then as we have those qualities down, then we can start, okay, well, Paul, how might we get there together? What might this look like? How could we fight less? You know, and I could even say to you, so Lauren, what's one thing that I could do that would send you a message that I'm trying to fight less with you? Mm-hmm. And that could be, don't roll your eyes when I talk. Right. Don't walk by my desk and ignore me. I mean, it could be whatever. And then you could say to me, what's one or two things that I could do? And then I could offer. And then now we're in a conversation and we're not trying to win and we're not trying to battle it out. So I think finding that is another key of de-escalation. It's another key of framing the conflict as a conversation. And what people think is impossible in a conflict is actually super possible. setting up the conversation so there is a win-win. Like 99% of conflicts, and they've actually done research on this, 99% of conflicts is winning and losing. That's what people fight, right and wrong. People are trying to win, the other person is trying to not lose, and the fight is around who's right and who's wrong. But what if you take all of that off the table? You figure out what common goal you have, what thing can you agree on, and then let's talk about the path to get there. Then both people win. Lauren doesn't roll her eyes at me, and I don't walk by her desk and ignore her. We've both got something that we both want. Doesn't mean we always get everything we want. But if we can start in that space, we can be way more effective. And in that sort of de-escalated, close to zero space, we can also be careful about the words that we choose. Because when we're in the tornado, there is no selection of words. It is just automatic reactionary. We can be more selective about the words that we use. We can give people the space of grace to not say it pretty and to not say it perfect. And we can start to lay simple groundwork of positive habits that we can pull from in the times of the crisis, in the times of the escalated conflict, in the times where someone comes by our desk or an inmate punches us or provokes us, and then we have a solid habit to pull from. What do y'all think about these tools? I mean, a lot of people, when I teach this class, they roll their eyes and go, oh my gosh, is this really going to work? So what do y'all think? Do you think it really work, or am I just crazy?
No, I don't think you're crazy. I think that's great advice. I think, obviously, as we talk about a lot, Lauren and I come at it from different perspectives, and I think over the years, that's what I have seen be effective. I think when you can put your own pride and your ego in your back pocket and look at things from not only your perspective, but actively listen to whoever, whether you're having a conflict with somebody, whether it's just as you're strategizing, give everybody the right to have their opinion as you develop the goals for the shift, for the team, for the organization, whatever. I think that's a big part of building the team. And so I think your advice, coming from having been able to do that over the years and see that, I come at it from a different perspective where I'm like, yeah, your advice is solid because I've seen that work. I mean, don't forget, I brought her to my organization in 2015 and laid out my entire third term as sheriff with your advice. So it's pretty easy for me to look at this and say it works because it worked. And we changed a lot of how we communicated. Changed a lot of terminology. Like we never used the word supervisor and subordinate anymore. We use supervisor. Why? Because it's demeaning. It means you're less than me. When you think of a subordinate, I'm subordinate to somebody, or I'm going to go talk to my subordinates. So you're telling me you're going to. And when you said that, it was like it resonated with us. We're like, yeah, it is kind of demeaning in a way. It means you're less than me. And when I hear that from you, it's me. If you're telling me, okay, you're my subordinate, so you do this, means I'm less than you. I'm hearing I'm less than you. You changed our vocabulary to say supervisor and supervisee. It's, yes, you're the supervisor. It doesn't mean you're better. It means you have more responsibility. All right. And I'm the supervisee. I have the responsibility to learn and to follow through with instructions and to communicate to my supervisor what's going on. And it did change our dynamic, and it was neat because I heard my lieutenant, some of my using that, and I at one point heard her correct. Somebody say, no, we don't use that term here. You're not less than. And to me, it very much validated bringing you in. It was a huge thing for us, and we laid out a roadmap. So like I said, coming from my perspective, when you open your mind to different ideas and change, and you take some of these tactics, I don't care if you're the sheriff of the organization, the jail administrator, or you're going back to G-Pod tonight and are going to communicate to inmates or your fellow coworkers, use these methods, try them. I challenge you to try them. You're going to find that you become a better communicator and that you find that your team relationship is better. It works. And so obviously, I'm sold. And we utilized a lot of those tactics. And, we changed a lot of our ways because of that advice.
Yeah, that's so powerful. It brings you back to my point earlier that words matter. And we all know they matter when we're on the receiving end of a bad word, right? But just what you said is so powerful, Paul, because the supervisor subordinate looks like this. I mean, when you have rank, you already know you're up here. Like, you don't have to beat people up with it. They know that you have more power and authority. Hello, they know it. But when you continue to say supervisor subordinate, you're making that gap bigger than it needs to be. When you do that, having a difficult conversation is way harder.
Right.
Because I already feel down here, and though people don't necessarily mean it in a negative way, like I don't think people go around and use subordinate trying to be insulting and demeaning, but when it's constantly heard, you constantly get the message, you're not the same, you're not as good as me, you're not as good as this other person that has higher rank, you're always on the bottom. And people in law enforcement, because of the paramilitary structure, the line level people feel on the bottom. And by the vocabulary change, and even in our strategic planning group, people, like we still know there's rank there, they felt equal. They felt like they had a voice. They felt they were just as important as somebody else, even if they didn't have the same role and responsibility in the organization.
I've always felt that if you have, individuals in the room of different ranks, and the individual that has to pull, or his or her, pull out their collar and say, why this? That's not the supervisee's problem. That's your insecurity that you have to remind everybody. You're not strong enough to do it on your own. You got to remind them you got the bars or the stars or the whatever. And I've seen that happen in the past. You're like, why? Because of this. Now, if you're doing it as a funny or something like that, that's one thing.
Right.
But if you're so insecure of your leadership that you got to flex your rank all the time, they're not the problem. You're the problem, and you need to fix it.
Right. And I just encourage y'all, even outside of a conflict, right? Because if we're going to build the arc, if we're really going to instill these positive habits long term, you have to be careful about your nonverbals every moment. You have to be careful about your words every moment. So the next time you're just in conversation with someone and you're tempted to say a word like, that's totally insulting, I challenge you to say, is it really totally insulting? It might be. That might be the perfect word. Or are you frustrated? Or do you just feel disrespected? Or do you feel misunderstood? So let's take those words, disrespected, insulted, misunderstood. Those have very different emotions attached to them, and they will elicit a very different reaction. So if you can be more intentional day to day about the words that you use in regular conversation, it will help you be more intentional when you're in a heightened conflict or conversation. Because most of us who get on the defensive or we're up in the tornado, we pick the most provocative word. Oh, you totally insulted me. When maybe it's like, I just feel disrespected and misunderstood. Mm. And if we're going to show it better, if we're going to be more intentional about de-escalating ourselves, de-escalating the space with somebody we're talking to, establishing better habits, we need to think about the words that we use day to day. Because I can tell you that the words you use on a regular basis, I can tell you that the thoughts you think on a regular basis is how you're going to show up in conflict. It's not going to be different. So it's better to practice now. Mm-hmm. And it's better to establish those habits now in our day-to-day life. And then we can have that habit to pull from in moments of crisis.
So you've talked about conflict and you've given us a lot of tools to kind of help people navigate it. Mm-hmm. But I'm guessing a lot of people still don't see it as an actual opportunity. And I'm guessing it is. So can you share a little bit about that?
Because we know you got a couple more tricks up your sleeve. I do. I know you.
I do. So it gets back to something that we all talked about in the first podcast. And we talked about in there reframing and the challenge of reframing, but also the gift in reframing. So I'll give you a few examples. So number one, instead of saying, well, this conflict is happening to me. This person did this to me. They said that I was insulting. They said that to me. This isn't right. They didn't listen. They provoked me, whatever it is. Instead of saying all of that, what if every difficult conversation, what if every conflict that you ever had in your life was not happening to you, it was actually happening for you? So think about that. Now, when we think about Thanksgiving and Christmas without Sally and Uncle Joe, it doesn't ever feel like a gift. But what if every difficult thing, what if every time somebody provoked us or pushed a button, it was just a test? It was a test of two things: our coping ability and our character. So think about that. If every difficult conversation, if every potential conflict that we have is just a test of our coping and our character, well, bring it on then, because I want to practice. It's going to be a test, and I want to pass that test. I want to not, and this is what we tend to do. This is us. We have all the good intentions, right? And this is the other person. And then they really get to us because we're tired and we're stressed and we weren't really well prepared today for conflict. What do we end up doing? We end up lowering our character to equal the character of the human that we're talking to. That's what most of us do in this country. That's what most of us do in relationship. That's what most of us do in this world, is we make our character equal the bozo we're talking to. Instead of, no matter what they do and what they say, we elevate our character. We tap into our coping skills and we use it as a test and say, I'm not going to do this. It's easy to get triggered. Yes, there's 20,000 things I want to say right now, and I'm not going to say any of them. I'm going to be curious and say, Paul, what's going on? Why did you approach me like that today? Help me understand, instead of doing the regular way. So, number one tool, believe that it is happening for you and not to you. Because you can have a victim mindset if you want, doesn't ever get you anywhere, or a victor mindset, or a positive mindset where you're going to turn every bad thing into something good for you. And the only person who can make that decision is you. Now, the second sort of way of reframing and finding the opportunity is, no matter how you show up in it, hopefully you practice a lot of these tools we talked about today, but even if you do it wrong, even if you make a mistake, even if you say the wrong word or you accidentally roll your eyes because they deserve an eye roll, ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Is there anything that I did better? Is there something I was like, oh man, that's one word that triggers me. I better work on that. It's all a journey. None of us are perfect. But if in every conflict you can find a lesson, you can practice something with intention, self-reflect, as Paul said afterwards, self-reflect, self-assess, find something else you can do better, then you're on the road. I don't do this perfect. Lauren doesn't do it perfect. Paul doesn't do it perfect. But what I can say we're all committed to is doing it better and learning from the mistakes that we make. Now, the third thing, and it's sort of what I started with in terms of opportunity. This is another way that I look at it. You cannot control anything anybody else ever does. Only thing you control is yourself. So whether I'm interacting with a person who I don't know at all, or maybe as a family member, I am going to control what I do and how I show up, because I am choosing to make this interaction an opportunity. Whether they step into it or not is on them. And I'm not owning their stuff. I'm only owning my stuff. So I'm going to show up well, and if they join me on this positive journey on making a conversation, then we're going to make it a conversation. But if they refuse to join in, if they are provocative, if they're super disrespectful, if they're attacking, I can set a boundary and say, you know what? I'm not having this conversation because all you're doing is screaming at me. And I don't care if you're my supervisor. I am not going to sit in this room and have you scream and attack and demean me. I'm happy to have a conversation about how I could do better for you, but I'm not doing it when you're yelling and screaming and attacking me, because this is not productive and I don't deserve it. You can set a boundary and you can walk away, and they don't have to like it, because that's their stuff. That's not your stuff. And if you feel like your only option is to engage in their bad character and their bad approach, I would say you're in the wrong agency or in the wrong relationship. Because people who want to get better will respect when you say, I can't do this right now. And similarly, when you're escalated in that tornado, one of the best things that you can say is, I do want to have this conversation. I cannot have this conversation right now. I am not in the emotional or mental space to respond to you in a positive way, and I choose to not respond to you in a bad way. So I need a day. I need 15 minutes. I need some space. so that I can show up well. And people also respect that because they don't want to be yelled at and screamed at and attacked either. So I think we have to intentionally look for the opportunity. We have to intentionally show up in a way that creates an opportunity. And we also have to remove ourselves from circumstances and situations that would hinder us from showing up and making it an opportunity.
Well, as always, you are very helpful, and I know our listeners out there, I hope you're taking a lot of notes and listening and getting this information. And as we said, we hope you're able to go back to your organizations and utilize what we've all talked about these last few shows. We're getting ready to close out, and we'll definitely tell you before we close here how they can reach you. But any final thoughts?
Well, I have a few because I can always talk more. So a few things is once you turn the conflict into a conversation, and let's say you found the common ground, you've understood each other's needs, and you've created some resolution or solution, even one that you're going to practice. Then what I would say is summarize together. So what's our understanding of how we're going to treat each other better? Let's make a commitment, Paul, between you and I about how we're going to move forward in the next 7 days. We don't have to figure out the next 7 years. We have to figure out the next 7 days. So what are you and I fundamentally going to do differently in our interactions? And we're going to test it out because it doesn't have to be perfect. We already say it's not going to be perfect, but
right.
But we both come to an agreement. I'm going to do this. Okay, you're going to do that. Obviously, if it's behavior change, we're going to say what the behavior is going to be. So no more rolling of the eyes and no more ignoring as I walk by her in a huff, right? So we get it down into behaviors that we can both see, we can both measure, we both agree on, and then we create a follow-up. And I see the lack of follow-up so much in personal relationships, but also in professional relationships. Like somebody's going to write a performance improvement plan for an employee and say, okay, do all these things, da-da-da. Okay, go. And I'll see you in 90 days. No, you got to check with them in a week. Are they doing it?
Yes.
Right? Because if they start practicing something and they're not doing it well, whether it's a PIP or not, it might just be an interpersonal commitment. But if you don't set a check-in time and you make the check-in time too long, people could be making mistakes. People could be upsetting each other. And if you check in, once a week or twice a month or whatever it is, then you can head off the other mistakes, the other errors before they suck you back into the tornado and they become huge. So whenever you're resolving a conflict, and it might take more than one conversation, what are you agreeing to be different? How are you going to measure that? When are you going to check in and see if it's working or not? Because it's the ongoing conversation after the initial sometimes is even more important to solidify the resolution and solidify the behavioral changes.
Well, awesome, as always. For any of you out there, we, in our shows with Dr. Miller, just get to touch the tip of the iceberg. The content is solid, but as you know, she could go so much deeper if she wanted to, if you need her to. How, if any of our organizations out there, any of our law enforcement leaders, any of the agencies want to discuss some of this with you, want to, do a webinar with you or bring you into their organizations, how do they get a hold of you? What's the easiest way to get a hold of you?
Right. The best thing is to go to my website, which is KimberlyMillerConsulting.com, all mushed together. And on there, you can go to my contact page. You can shoot me an email. You can learn more about all the different stuff that I do. So go read about my company, read about all the classes. I have like 60 of them now, oh my gosh, that I do in person and online. And reach out to me. Drop me a message in the contact page, and I will get back with you and have a conversation. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, and as I said, I could vouch for you. You definitely changed our course and helped us become a better organization. And as law enforcement leaders, our commitment is to our communities, our commitment is to our people, and we always want to be better, and she will help you be better. So I can't thank you enough for coming in.
Thanks,
as always, great professional advice. So will you come back and join us again?
Of course. I love it.
We're kind of adopting you into the TKC family here, and we love what you bring and what we're able to bring. Our goal here is to support law enforcement, and especially at a time where they need it more than anything, is we want to bring that quality training, and you're here to help us do that. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all again soon.
That sounds great.
All right. Well, I'm Paul Laney.
And I'm Lauren Matthews.
And you've been listening to Jail Talk, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, y'all.